Today we are going to go over hormone classification. So we're going to go over whether a hormone is derived from either a steroid hormone or tyrosine or protein-derived hormone. And then within each group, we're going to kind of talk about their solubility, how to remember different examples of them, their mechanism, the way that they are transported, and just how the different groups differ from each other. And then within each group and their specific examples, we're going to talk about where are each of these hormones produced, like either in the pancreas, in the adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla, stuff like that. So let's get started. We are going to start with protein-derived hormones or peptide hormones. The first thing that we're going to discuss is composition. So protein hormones, if you could have already guessed, are chains of amino acids. And then we're also going to talk about solubility. And since they are amino acids, they are going to be hydrophilic, meaning they are very polar. So they're not going to be able to pass through cell membranes. Instead, they're going to have to bind to a receptor on the cell membrane surface to be ingested into the cell. So we'll make note of that. Hydrophilic or water soluble, which means they cannot pass through cell membrane. So instead they have to bind to cell surface receptors. The next thing we're going to talk about is transport, so how they are transported throughout the body before actually reaching the cell. And so since it is lipid soluble, these peptide hormones, they are going to be able to travel around freely in the bloodstream before arriving at a target cell. So travel freely in the blood, but they're going to need to bind to receptors on the target cell, which we already kind of talked about above in solubility, since they can't just go straight through the membrane. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about before we get to examples is the mechanism. This is just going to be how these hormones induce a cellular response. So for peptide hormones, as we said, they bind to receptors on the surface of the cell, and they use a secondary messenger system. So this means it's going to bind, and then the binding of that receptor causes another cascade to happen within the cell, and it's going to cause a reaction. So it's not necessarily the peptide hormone itself that is doing all of the cellular responses. It's going to be that secondary messenger system. And an example of this, if you remember something called the CAMP pathway, that's just a secondary messenger pathway example that a peptide hormone could induce. So now we're going to move on to some examples of peptide hormones. So there are a lot of peptide hormones. It's probably easier to remember what is not a peptide hormone than what is a peptide hormone, but I'm just going to write down some of the main examples, and I'm going to vary them based on color, based off of what gland that they are secreted from. And then at the very end of the video, we'll kind of put it all together, all the different branches of these hormones and where they come from. So first we are going to start with insulin and glucagon. And these are our blood sugar hormones. And if you remember from the biochemistry pathways video of the glycogen synthesis and breakdown and their hormones, insulin and glucagon are from the pancreas, and they are important in regulating blood sugar levels. The next examples are going to be hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary, and there's quite a few of these. So we have FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. There is LH, which is luteinizing hormone. ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. That one always trips me up, but ACTH is just easy to remember. There is GH, which is just growth hormone. There is prolactin, and then also endorphins, and then TSH. So these can have varying effects. FSH, LH, prolactin, those are all going to be more reproductive hormones. And then endorphins, which are kind of like our natural opioid-like peptides. These can act as like pain relievers and stuff like that. But this is all from the posterior pituitary, and we'll go over how to kind of remember some of these in a second. Now we're going to zoom back out and we're going to start looking at tyrosine-derived hormones. So we finished the protein-derived hormones. Tyrosine-derived hormones are also amine hormones. Let's first start with their composition. These are derived from the amino acid tyrosine. Shocking, I know. Now let's talk about solubility. These ones are a little bit trickier because they can be either hydrophobic or hydrophilic. They're not really like peptide hormones where they're usually all just hydrophilic. They can be both, kind of depending on the specific modifications of the individual hormone. And we can say that this is just depending on its specific modification. Okay, next we are going to talk about the way that they are transported throughout the body. So because some are hydrophilic and some are hydrophobic, some are going to require a carrier protein and some are not. So the hydrophilic ones, like the peptide hormones, are not going to need a carrier protein because they can just dissolve straight into the blood. But the hydrophobic ones are going to need a carrier protein. So we can say hydrophilic is just going to be straight in the bloodstream. An example of a hormone that can do this is going to be your catecholamines. And then your hydrophobic are going to need carrier proteins. And this can be stuff like your thyroid hormones. All right, now let's move on to the mechanism in which they act. Now, again, it's going to be split up in two different mechanisms since they are not all transported and they don't all have the same solubility. So for those kind of catecholamines, these are just going to act like peptide hormones, which, as we mentioned earlier, is the secondary messenger system. And then those thyroid hormones, these are going to act like steroid hormones, which means they will directly affect gene function. And we'll get a little bit more into detail about that when we talk about our steroid hormones. But just now you can kind of visualize that the tyrosine-derived hormones are kind of in the middle between protein and steroid. They can go either way. All right, and then lastly for tyrosine hormones, we're going to go over some examples. So as we said, there are those thyroid hormones and then the catecholamines. And then the catecholamines are going to be things like your dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, stuff like that. And then your thyroid hormones are going to be T3 and T4. So we can do our catecholamines, we can do epinephrine, which is also adrenaline, norepinephrine, dopamine. These are all going to be secreted by the adrenal medulla. And then we have T3 and T4, which are our thyroid hormones. And then lastly, which we didn't mention above, melatonin is also a tyrosine-derived hormone. Moving on, we are going to talk about steroid hormones, which is the last type of hormone that we're going to cover. So let's start off with their composition. These are derived from cholesterol. Their solubility, they are going to all be hydrophobic, meaning they can just pass straight through cell membranes. And the way that they're transported throughout the body, they are going to require carrier proteins, since they cannot just diffuse straight into the bloodstream like our peptide and then some of our tyrosine hormones. Their mechanism of action is that they can bind to intracellular receptors. So this means they can just go straight through the cell membrane, and then instead of binding to a receptor on the outside surface, they're going to bind to a receptor that is inside the cell, and this is going to directly alter the gene expression. So we can say that they are going to regulate gene expression. All right, and then lastly, let's just go over some steroid hormone examples. Two big ones from the adrenal cortex are aldosterone and cortisol. And then some other major steroid hormones are going to be your sex hormones, which are like testosterone, estrogen, proestrogen, stuff like that. And then lastly, just another example of a steroid hormone is going to be vitamin D. All right, so these are the different types of hormones. We went over their composition, their solubility, how they travel in the body, how they initiate a cellular response, and we went over some examples. And so I color-coded some of these examples. So now we're gonna go in and kind of talk about, of the hormones that we listed, where do they come from, and just a really brief explanation of kind of what kind of response they initiate in the body. Starting off with insulin and glucagon. These are going to be your pancreatic hormones. your pancreas hormones, these are going to be insulin and glucagon. I don't really have a fun mnemonic to remember this one. Just know that these are the ones that mostly affect the glycolysis pathway, and I have videos going over that. Now, in light blue, all of these peptide hormones are going to come from the anterior pituitary. So we're going to go through kind of one at a time, talking about what each one does. FSH, this is going to stimulate egg and sperm production. Next we have LH, which is luteinizing hormone, and this is going to stimulate ovulation and testosterone production, which happen during menstrual cycles. Next we are going to talk about ACTH, and this just stimulates the adrenal cortex, which produces cortisol. So this is a kind of tropic hormone that basically acts by initiating another hormone. Next, we're going to talk about growth hormone, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just growth and metabolism. Next, we're going to talk about prolactin, which is milk production. Then we have endorphins, which we said were those natural opioids and pain suppressants. And then lastly, we have TSH, and this is going to stimulate the thyroid to produce hormones. So thyroid stimulation, another kind of tropic hormone. Okay, that seems like a lot, but how I remember these is by the first letter of each one of these. So I'll underline them to make it a little easier. So F, L, A, G, P, E, T, flag pet. Or pet flag if you prefer to switch it, or if you can think of a different mnemonic that will help you better. This is just how I remember it. But those are all of the anterior pituitary hormones, and these are all going to be peptide hormones like we said earlier. So we finished the anterior pituitary, and before I move on to the posterior pituitary, I'm going to come back up here to these examples from the peptide hormones, and I'm just going to clean it up. And I'm going to add on oxytocin and ADH. So oxytocin and ADH. Now these are important because these are hormones from the posterior pituitary. Just to make it all cohesive, I'm going to label where these are from as we go. So we said these was the pancreas, and we said this was the anterior pituitary. And now we're moving on to these two, which are going to be the posterior pituitary. Okay, perfect. And while we're at it, why don't we go ahead and label these as insulin being lowers blood glucose and glucagon raises. Okay, so now let's move on to the posterior pituitary gland. I'm going to write this over here. So posterior pituitary. Okay, so the two main hormones for the posterior pituitary is oxytocin and ADH. So oxytocin has to do with milk ejection and labor, where ADH has to do with blood pressure. So it increases blood pressure, and it does this through water retention, kind of the moving of ions for different pressures, and we can go over that later, but right now just know that ADH has to do with an increased blood pressure. Okay, so we've finished all of our peptide hormones. We can zoom out, kind of see the big picture. We finished all of our protein-derived hormones. We have the pancreas and the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. Those are the main things that are going to produce these protein-derived hormones. Now let's move over to these catch-all amines that we said were tyrosine derived. So these epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, these are all going to be from the adrenal medulla. All right, and we'll match our colors. So adrenal medulla. This is going to be epinephrine and norepinephrine. And I'm gonna put a star next to dopamine because it is one of those catch-all amines that we were talking about that are the tyrosine derived, but it is not completely produced in the adrenal medulla. A little bit of it can be, but the main production is in the brain by like the hypothalamus. Because it functions as a neurotransmitter there. But there's a very, very small amount that can be produced in the adrenal medulla, but just to remember everything together, I'm just gonna put it here. So epinephrine has to do with flight or flight response. So this is like increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, adrenaline, all that good stuff. And then norepinephrine has to do with vasoconstriction, and it also increases your blood pressure, and your heart rate. So I'm going to say vasoconstriction, and then I'm going to say heart rate and blood pressure increase. Dopamine, as we know, is the reward system, and it also inhibits prolactin. And if you remember, prolactin is what we talked about the anterior pituitary produces. So that is the adrenal medulla. Now, the next is this T3 and T4. This is just going to be the thyroid. Thyroid-produced hormones are there to regulate metabolism. So thyroid is T3, T4. These regulate metabolism. And melatonin is going to be the pineal gland. Pineal. And as we know, melatonin has to do with the sleep-wake cycle. All right, so those are all of the tyrosine-derived hormones that we have discussed. Now moving on to the last section of hormones are those steroid-derived hormones. So we're starting off with aldosterone and cortisol. These are going to be from the adrenal cortex. Now the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla are very different, so do not get them confused. I'll show you a little trick how I remember these two hormones. But we can go ahead and write down aldosterone and cortisol. Aldosterone is going to be blood pressure regulation, and it does this by sodium retention. Now, cortisol, on the other hand, is your stress hormone. So this is what gets produced in the stress response, and it suppresses your immune system and it increases your blood glucose. So we can just write down stress hormone. You can say blood glucose increases and then immune decreases. All right, and I remember this just because adrenal cortex, AC, aldosterone, cortisol, AC. That's how I remember, as to not get the cortex confused with the medulla. So AC, adrenal cortex, AC. That's just how I remember. These are all going to be produced in the reproductive tract. So I'll go ahead and label that down here. Reproduction. We have testosterone, and this is going to be produced in the testes, more specifically the Leydig cells, and this is male secondary characteristics. And then we have estrogen and progesterone. These are both going to be produced in the ovaries and the placenta. And estrogen is female secondary characteristics, and then progesterone is going to be what maintains pregnancy. All right, and then the very last one that we talked about was vitamin D. And vitamin D, I'm just gonna note up here, is produced in the skin, the liver, and the kidneys. So not one main gland like the other one, since it is a vitamin, but it is steroid derived, so that's why I put it on here. The main thing that it does is it just regulates calcium absorption. So calcium, we think of how we build bones. Vitamin D, we think of building bones, milk, all that good stuff. So that is everything that I have for you on the different classifications of hormones. We talked about the 3 different types: protein, tyrosine, and steroid, and how their composition varies, how their solubility varies, how their mechanisms and their transport targets vary. And then we also went over some of the main broad examples of these different types of hormones and where they are produced. But that is all that I have for this video. All of the completed notes will be on the link tree under biology and then hormone classifications. And I will see you next time.